Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Justin Callais. Hello, Justin. How are you doing?
Hi, Lipton. I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on.
So, Justin, you are doing a PhD, right?
Yes, correct. Yes, I'm getting a PhD in Ag and Applied Economics at Texas Tech University.
But you all are already writing brilliant papers. I've been looking at a few of them.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I've been, working hard and trying to get ideas out there and really, get all in academia. So yeah.
Yeah, I would love to interview more prospective PhDs, but I fear that some of them could be busy. So I send them less emails.
Well, while busy, yeah. I mean, I could definitely, introduce you to some if you were interested. I think that's definitely a really good idea.
Yeah, so we'll talk about this via email. So, Justin, recently you wrote a paper and I wrote an article after your paper was published, and you are cited in this article. My article is on the resource curse.
Mhm.
Justin, what is the resource curse?
So the resource curse is basically an argument that states that these areas or countries that are high in natural resources, that there's a high incentive for governments to use extractive institutions to collect those resources versus the type of institutions that lead to economic growth. So if you see a lot of oil producing countries typically are have high corruption, while they have high incomes in times of oil booms, but they're very cyclical in the sense of that reliant on oil, and they don't have the institutions in place that allow for this kind of long run sustainable economic growth that we've seen in a lot of other countries that allow for prosperity.
But Justin, look at Norway. Norway has resources, but it isn't poor. And then we can also compare Botswana to its counterparts in Africa. Botswana did not suffer from the Dutch disease. So why are some countries immune to the resource curse?
This is actually a very good point. So I'm glad you brought this up, and I probably should have clarified it a little bit in my in the first answer, is because the way I see it, at least, and the way that our argument in the Louisiana corruption paper that you were referencing, is places can have resources and still be have great good institutions and still be productive, but there is a heavy incentive for governments to use these extractive institutions instead. I think why some places, or or why do we see perverse outcomes in some places versus others? And my example that I used was Texas versus Louisiana. Texas has pretty solid economic institutions. They have high levels of economic freedom. They allow for businesses. Louisiana, on the other hand, is a little bit more in terms of highly corrupt. Does not have the institutions in place that really allow for businesses to flourish. I think when you kind of put these together, what you end up getting is the places that have natural resources that allow for business activity and entrepreneurship tend to do better, and low levels of corruption, they tend to succeed because they take advantage of their resources that are available, but they aren't overly reliant on those resources. Louisiana, on the other hand, very reliant on oil. They don't have the infrastructure in place to have other industries. So it really is the combination of what institutions do you pick, along with having um, the natural resource abundance. If you have the natural resource abundance, but you pick good institutions, you do well. On the other hand, if you have high resources, but you pick bad institutions, well, you're going to, do well when oil or the other resources are doing well. But whenever the price of those resources fall, you're going to fall into economic downturns much more easily. So I think there's just a tendency for often for places to with high resource abundances to pick poor institutions. But obviously that's not the case all the time. And in the places that don't, right, like Norway or Texas, you see much better outcomes.
And is Louisiana being adversely affected by the legacy of civil law?
I argue, yes. I think absolutely. I think in a lot of ways, French civil law is overly rigid, and they push apart the judicial branch. They make the judicial branch less important. Kind of, well, at least in the historically the way France did it. France specifically picked this specific legal system when they were writing their constitution to make it where Napoleon had a lot of power and he didn't want judges to overrule him. So he put in these institutions in place. He put this legal system in place that led to basically judges being less important, and Napoleon instead, or the executive branch, was writing the laws. So whenever they then implemented this legal system into other areas, well, those areas wouldn't necessarily have picked the same legal systems, if that makes sense. There's no reason to think that each of these areas that they essentially imported the legal system into these areas, there's no reason to think that they would have necessarily picked that same legal system. So whenever you put these legal systems in place that were not chosen by the area, not taking into account any cultural or just different political preferences of areas, you have these perverse outcomes. So in Louisiana, for example, the governor of Louisiana typically has, or tends to have, more power than almost any other governor across the states. So I argue in the paper you were referencing that Louisiana has these worse outcomes in terms of corruption, worse regulations, worse many outcomes, worse education, worsening incomes, because they have this system of over influence from the executive branch. They make the legal system, or the judicial branch specifically, less important.
All right. And let's talk about corruption. Is Louisiana corrupt?
Yes, absolutely. I think if you look at any sort of well, if you just ask anyone from Louisiana, it's almost like a proud, not proud, but it's a funny kind of inside joke that we all talk about, right? But if you look at the limited data that is available on corruption across the U.S., what you'll see is that Louisiana doesn't always rank first in these 3 or 4 different categories that people use. They, either surveys of journalists in terms of conviction rates for like government officials. Louisiana doesn't always rank first among these, or worse, and not first in the sense of you want to be, but first in the sense of where you don't want to be. But they always rank in the top 5. They're the only state that is in the top 5 in every single category that has been used to track corruption. So I think Louisiana is, my home state. I love it, but it is very corrupt. It is, and a lot of deals are done in back rooms. A lot of deals within Louisiana are made just based off of political knowledge. Basically, are you able to properly talk to the right person? Do you know the right people to get ahead? And those aren't the types of institutions that allow for flourishing relative to, the richer states in the United States. These other states, every single area is going to have some level of corruption. But I do think Louisiana most certainly jumps out. If you look at 2 of the more infamous governors, Edwin Edwards and Huey P. Long, I mean, they were well known at the time as well as after the fact for being overly corrupt. If you look at Edwin Edwards, there was, when he was running for re-election, I can't exactly remember the year, but it was, I think, his 3rd term running. He was running against David Duke, who was a KKK Grand Wizard. They were running against each other for governor, and there was kind of this informal slogan that was going around, was that you need to vote for the crook, meaning Edwin Edwards. It's important because, well, we're choosing between a felon who went to jail for corrupt activity and a Grand Wizard. Okay, so I mean, it's not exactly, that was not exactly Louisiana's brightest moment, but I think it's at least an interesting anecdotal story of how prevalent Louisiana's corruption is.
Yes, Louisiana isn't the only corrupt place in the world. There are many countries that are corrupt, and some studies do show that corruption can impede growth, but under some circumstances, there might be a positive relationship between corruption and economic growth. So if a country is overly regulated, then bribes can actually accelerate the business process by and induce growth.
Yeah, I think this is actually a really good point, and I agree to an extent, right? That if if we had to choose the situation between a monopoly, which tends to happen in overly regulated, corrupt areas where you basically bribe off somebody and they give you the sole right to do something. Well, when it comes from pure economic welfare standpoint, we prefer monopoly over no market at all, right? So if you had to choose between one of the two, right, they're not neither one's a great option, but it's always this compared to what. So in the situation of if you cannot, if there was someone, for example, who you wanted someone to build a banana stand, and it was either only one person could build a banana stand in this area or no one can, well, from a market standpoint, you'd prefer the sole person being able to produce it and sell it rather than nobody at all. So I do think in very dire situations, there is some cases where, or there's a case to be made where corruption can accelerate activity. But if, it's only in, I guess it's only in the subset of the worst situations.
And the corruption can create a negative cultural effect. So if you're residing in a corrupt country, people will assume that success is linked to luck and your political connections. And as a result of this belief, in the long term, people are going to be less inclined to produce.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think even I'm just thinking, an anecdotal evidence isn't always the best, but I think it at
Mm.
least brings to light some interesting examples from my knowledge in Louisiana. Is you hear people, because Louisiana is also a heavily occupational license state, they have the most low income um, occupations that have licenses. I believe it's about 80% of potential occupations have licenses in Louisiana. Even for they're the only one for florists. They're one of the few for funeral directors and other occupations like that. So one thing you'll hear is, even if the practices get reversed, you'll see some people, start, going into these fields better. But there's also this knowledge information problem that people don't know about it, or they just kind of assume based off of their kind of what they've been told their whole lives living in Louisiana, that it's not possible to do these things. It's not possible to actually um, build a business and grow and have success, because the kind of joke or the assumption is that, well, you need to know somebody in order to get anything done.
Yes, it's just like in Jamaica, the famous saying, links run Jamaica.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yeah, so
it's a
I
good point.
understand clearly what you're talking about because I also live in a corrupt country. Yes, and in this country,
If
people,
I
yes,
believe I'm correct, it's a civil law country, right?
no, Jamaica is a common law country.
Oh, it was common law.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah,
yes, yeah,
sorry,
British
yeah.
colony. So I didn't see, yeah, originally I didn't see that I am from Jamaica, but Jamaica has the common law just like Singapore, another ex-British colony. But it's
Okay, yeah,
corrupt.
sorry.
Its
Mhm.
institutions were degraded. Actually, in the 1970s, there was a commission to purge the public service of capitalists. So the institutions were degraded in Jamaica over time.
Yeah, well, that definitely does not sound like something that would be beneficial
Yes.
for economic activity. Yeah.
So in his 2001 paper, Mahoney lauds the economic benefits of the common law. And I actually read this paper, and one of Mahoney's supporters is Laporta, but I'm going to read Hayek's statement. English common law developed as it did because landed aristocrats and merchants wanted a system of law that would provide strong protections for property and contract rights and limit the crown's ability to interfere in markets. French civil law, by contrast, developed as it did because the revolutionary generation and Napoleon after it wished to use state power to alter property rights and attempted to ensure that judges could not interfere. So the common law system is quite flexible. It's based on case law. Thereby, cases are analyzed based on their own merit. So there's an opportunity for judges to be more flexible, whereas the civil law is depicted as a rigid code. So it is less flexible. And the Business is always evolving. Therefore, in this context, the case law would appear to be more suitable.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that quote. I think that's, I think that it kind of really does a good job of highlighting the differences between these two laws. Common law, historically, yeah, I mean, these were put in place because merchants wanted protection for their property, and they, it was in a way a fight back against the aristocrat rule, while civil law in France was put in place because Napoleon basically wanted to be able to do whatever he wanted, and he didn't want those pesky judges getting in his way.
And I read that quote because usually people say the common law is correlated with economic growth, but they don't explain why.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's why I read the quote. So if the common law is correlated with economic growth because it is flexible, why is it flexible? This is not something that's explained frequently in public debates. People just say, okay, the common law is flexible, and the French
Yeah.
law is a rigid code, and they never cite data or provide a real philosophical or economic argument. But what I find really funny is that in the beginning of your article, this is how you start. Louisiana is as associated with political corruption as it is with Mardi Gras and Gumbo. In the 1991 Louisiana gubernatorial race, the unofficial campaign slogan for one candidate that made its way on bumpers across the state was "Vote for the crook. It's important."
That was probably my favorite two sentences to write in an academic article so far. I must admit that was a particularly fun one to write. Yeah, I think I believe I mentioned a little bit of background on that before, but that specific one was the race between Edwin Edwards, who had a known corrupt politician, a known, went to jail for these corrupt practices.
It's just like in
People
Jamaica.
were saying, okay, well, if we had to choose between these two, I guess.
Yeah, it's just like in Jamaica when a prime minister said, "Let in the pirates steal."
That's
Yes,
funny.
and a member of his administration, this was like over 20 years ago in the early 2000s, she said, "Jamaicans don't care about corruption." Yeah, he was a minister of government. Yes, a senior
Well,
person in the
I
party
could see
saying this.
I can see why she thinks people don't care about corruption, but I would imagine the average citizen probably cares a lot that, so much is being pushed back by corrupt practices. And of course, the government official doesn't want to put too much emphasis on corruption and mention, oh, people don't care about it. It's just the way we do things, and it doesn't actually have any harm. Don't worry about it.
Louisiana's constitutions are notoriously long, which has led to some potential channels of further corruption and centralization of power to the governor.
Mhm.
Explain.
So yeah, so Louisiana's constitutions, like you mentioned, are pretty notoriously known for being quite long. And one of the reasons, I guess, in this kind of civil law way, you're thinking of rigid, right? Very rigid. Everything is kind of defined. The state budget in Louisiana is, there's parts of it put in the Constitution. So, for example, a lot of discretionary spending is put in the Constitution. So any sort of additional changes you want to make to the state budget is very difficult to amend. So it doesn't allow for basically changing of political preferences among citizens. It doesn't really allow for changing situations in terms of, in terms of crisis. Like think of the coronavirus, there could be instances where it is harder to get funding allocated from one area to another in Louisiana precisely because you have this situation where if something's, embedded in the Constitution, that makes it a lot harder to change than just being any regular old law or any regular old bill or any sort of other spending allocation. So I think that is one way in which Louisiana, it's shown that Louisiana is more corrupt through these long constitutions that allow for a lot of rent seeking to happen. A lot of people come in and they decide, what needs to kind of, or they don't decide, but they bargain with their political authorities. They put specific things in these bills that, or in the Constitution that they want. it happens, but this makes the Constitution much longer. This also means that there's less choices that can be made by the legislator. So this is just another situation where basically this through this legal system, through this Constitution, more power is put in the branch of the executive. Because if you give the legislators less things that they can actually vote on and change, well, that means, well, if the judicial branch is less important and the legislative branch is less important because there's less things they can vote on, you end up with, okay, well, there's only one branch left, and that's the executive branch. So the executive branch can make a lot more decisions than in many other states.
Justin, long laws, not just long constitutions, create a mechanism for corruption and political lobbying. There's always room for sector interest to cannibalize law.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I definitely agree. There's a little bit of academic work that's been done on.
I'm going to cite it by Berkowitz and
Okay,
Clay.
yeah.
Yes, I was just about to read this section of the article. As pointed out by Berkowitz and Clay, 2005, 10 American states have roots in civil law legal systems. Louisiana is the only state that has officially retained that influence. However, the other 9 states have some less pronounced persistent effects from that historical influence. For example, the previously cited study shows that this influence led to longer constitutions that were more detailed than their common law counterparts. This constitutional length created an increase in demand for constitutional change, which led to constitutional instability and lower court quality. Furthermore, the authors argue in a subsequent study that civil law states allow less judicial independence due to the different preferences regarding the balance of power between the legislative and judicial branch.
Yeah, I really like their argument, and I think that is one thing that I guess most people aren't familiar with, is the fact that there were 10 states that had this kind of culture in civil law, or at least originally, right? They were very quick to replace it with common law. Louisiana's been the only one that isn't, or the only one that hasn't. But yeah, so I really like the argument that they make, that these civil law states basically had a lot more constitutional instability, because if so many things had to be decided in the Constitution. So if you actually want to change something, then you actually have to go and change the Constitution. Well, if a Constitution is there for the purpose of providing the rules of the game, as Douglas North would say, the rules of the game of society, how is society structured? Well, if you have a Constitution that's changing quite often in a place that already has worse legal institutions in terms of having less judicial independence and worsening, or relative worse quality of legal systems, that's going to lead to these kind of perverse outcomes that we see.
Yes, and is it also a legacy of the civil law why Louisiana is heavily regulated?
Yes, I think there's a pretty direct comparison here. There's been a good bit of work, for example, by Laporte, I believe, that you mentioned earlier, that places, civil law countries, tend to have much more burdensome regulations. And then part of this is because these regulations are put in place precisely for rent-seeking purposes, right? Or oftentimes, at least. People basically, bargain their political legislators or governors or presidents, or, depending on which level we're talking about, to put in these rules that make it harder and put in bigger barriers to make it harder for people to conduct business. So, right, because if you're the one who is currently doing business, and you can put in a law that says no one else can do the thing that you're doing, or make it much harder, increase the costs associated with doing it, this makes business activity or competition harder to occur, because there's less people who can legally actually compete with you. And one thing I think that's most important, that I didn't really touch on in the paper too much, but I think is kind of important, and I believe you and Vincent talked about it, is how this these regulations impact this kind of income and social mobility, right? So these regulations are specifically put in, or they're specifically put in place, and they have the most direct harm on the poorest people, because the poorest people have the less ability to pay all of these occupational licensing fees, or to withhold 6 months of income in order to go get this the license that you need, get the training needed to secure a hairdresser license or a florist license or something like that. So I think these has very perverse outcomes that, even if it wasn't intentional, like that, I don't know if it's necessarily true that all these laws are put in place to potential to definitely keep poor people poorer. But I think that is just an unintended consequence of these laws, that if you make it harder for someone to compete with you, well, then you're making it harder for someone to climb the income ladder. You're making it harder for people to climb the income ladder. They're going to be kind of stuck in that bottom rung.
It is a Baptist and the bootlegger situation. Actually, I find it quite surprising that more people are not applying this analogy to rent seeking in the public sector. And let me explain what I mean. Occupational licensing. Some groups want to increase costs and limit competition. So obviously they're in favor of occupational licensing. And then politicians gain psychic rewards by contending that these regulations will protect consumers. So it is a Baptist bootlegger situation.
I actually hadn't thought of it in that sense, but I think your argument makes a lot of sense. I think there is an interesting parallel there that hasn't been touched on before. So I think that's
Exactly. That's why
that's
it's
quite interesting.
surprising.
Yeah.
It's really I should have been an economist. It's not too late.
It's I would say it's not. I was just about to say that it's not too late. There's
Yeah.
plenty of people who go later on. Yeah.
Yeah, I should have been an economist. But I'm going to read this crucial sentence on page 23. Civil law was an efficient institutional outcome for France, but this legal system was likely not efficient for areas where France transported its legal institutions. And it was efficient for France because at that time, the French really wanted to promote stability. So there was an incentive to centralize power. This might explain the resource curse in Louisiana. Louisiana was essentially forced into a legal system that it did not choose. Civil laws tend to concentrate power to a centralized government. In France, this was chosen as a trade-off in favor of dictatorship as a means of lowering disorder. What this means for Louisiana and other transplant areas more generally is that centralized control lead to ineffective governance and corruption. So it's a negative residue of a specific French system that was applicable during a particular period, a rather ancient period.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in regards to this specific point, and why we see these worse outcomes in these areas, and not necessarily in France. Like France isn't necessarily as corrupt as all the other places that have civil law, which might lead somebody to think that, okay, well, maybe it's not civil law itself. But I argue, and people before me that like who you were talking about in previous questions, argue that this exactly happened because France chose a legal system, right? They had the ability, privilege, whatever you want to call it, to choose their own legal system. They chose one based on their own political preferences. They chose one right on the trade-off relative to they were choosing on the relative trade-off between dictatorship, right? So Napoleon was, very authoritarian, but if the alternative was dictatorship, well, then the choice of Napoleon running a lot of things seemed not as bad. However, whenever this legal system, right, is specifically put in place and implemented in other areas that don't necessarily have the same political preferences, the same informal norms, the same culture, the same historical backgrounds as France, this leads to these perverse outcomes because you're putting in a very rigid institution in a place that might not necessarily have chosen, that rigid of an institution to begin with. They might have chosen something a little bit more flexible, like common law.
And this abundance of resources will create opportunities for the elites to become more extractive, extractive, though lowering opportunities for legitimate businesses.
Yes, and I think one case, because this was one thing that was probably the hardest part of writing the paper, is trying to truly draw the point of that it's civil law leading to corruption, not the fact that Louisiana is an oil state. And while I was kind of looking into all of this, I found an interesting case study of a slaughterhouse in New Orleans in the 1800s, so before oil was ever before oil was a big industry in Louisiana. And what was happening in the slaughterhouse case was, well, this shown, very corrupt practices. What ended up was happening was the slaughterhouse was trying to get a license or the sole rights to be the sole like slaughterhouse company in the area. And what you ended up finding was a lot of politicians were actually stockholders in the New Orleans slaughterhouse company. Um, so this kind of corrupt practices didn't come about just from oil. They came about because of the civil law legal systems where things had to be done through basically political knowledge versus market knowledge.
Yes, and this should have been explained by us earlier, but I have to repeat it again. France in the 11th to 13th century had a high level of disorder when compared to England. This
Mhm.
made their potential institutional arrangements less attractive than England. And this is why I said earlier that the civil law was created for an Asian period, the 11th to 13th century.
Mhm. Yeah, I think yes. Yes, you did mention this earlier, and it is a good point. It France, right? Like you can't just choose whatever system you want, just all just and like snap a finger and it's done. There's processes to go through all of this. There's political process. There's historical knowledge that goes into this. So France was not at whenever they were choosing this political system, they were not as stable as England. So their choice sets, right, their constraints in choosing their political proceedings was less vast. They didn't really have the option of choosing the something similar to the English legal system. They were kind
Yes,
of they were choosing what was best for them at the time. The problem comes, which was fine for them. The problem comes about is whenever you are forcing these um, cases onto everybody else. You could also think of this as it's a similar. There's at least parallels to you see the people saying, "Oh, we'll just adopt the U.S. Constitution," right? That's always an argument that is made for other countries. Like, "Oh, you want to get richer? Just do what the U.S. did, adopt their Constitution." And you've seen this, kind of trying to implement the U.S. Constitution in other places, and they don't work as well because there are constraints, and that is something that I think needs to be addressed and now and kind of known is that there's these constraints that are put in place that lead to of why you choose these different institutional backgrounds whenever you try to force an area to implement a political system that they probably would not have chosen or had not chosen in the past on their own. That could lead to some perverse outcomes for sure.
uh, the Americans believe in a strict separation of power. Secondly, America is a legacy of British institutions and cultures. America's political system was impacted by England, and England has a long history of freedom and respect for property rights. So if you're not
Mhm.
coming from that background of freedom and the strict separation of power, culturally, the American Constitution could be inapt.
Yes, I think that is, that's without a doubt, I think true.
Because separation of separation of powers, it sounds nice. It really does. But for people who are not from that culture where the independence of respective government agencies is highly valued, that could create a real problem. So if corruption, like Louisiana and other places, is literally a part of the social heuristics, then can the American Constitution legitimate that culture? It's difficult. Culture can change, but it changes slowly.
Mhm. I think that's a good point in the sense that culture does change, right? People's preferences and people's willingness to accept different things do change over time. they tend to change slowly, right? So if you put in a quick and fast approach to something that is a slow evolving process, I don't know if you're going to necessarily get good outcomes, right? Like I think you see this to some extent, and there's cases where this does work, right? If you look at the Washington Consensus, places that adopted economic freedom, they followed the Washington Consensus, right? They often, and that led to higher incomes. These places did get richer, but they chose that, right? They
Yes.
went through the process of implementing better economic institutions,
And
better
sometimes, and
property
sometimes
rights protections.
Yes, and sometimes there is a reversal. So look at Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. All of these countries have a social market economy, not a socialist economy, because in Scandinavia, tax rates were lowered, and studies do show that Scandinavians value autonomy. And even though they are not as individualistic as Americans, they are still more individualistic than people in other places.
Mhm.
Scandinavian countries, even when they are quite socialist, there is not a massive reversal of the free market. Look at Chile, for example, and Argentina. These countries often fluctuate in their ability to adopt the free market, and today policies in Chile are being reversed. And why? For obvious reason. Chile, Chile's culture is still collectivistic. Au- Denmark values autonomy, and one study actually argues that people in Scandinavia prefer government welfare because it insulates them from the indignity of relying on their neighbor. So even support for government welfare is linked to autonomy.
Mhm.
And individualistic cultures are more likely to promote deregulation. Chile and Argentina, yes, they were populated by Europeans, but they don't have the same culture of individualism and autonomy.
I think that, yeah, that's I hadn't thought of this exact argument before, but I think my first reaction is that I think it makes a lot of sense. And one thing I'll mention specifically with the Scandinavian countries is that it wasn't like they had all of these kind of large state welfare systems and the entire time, and then right, like I think the direction that most likely happened was that they got
Markets to
rich and
welfare.
then they could afford. Yeah, but then you could also, once you become rich through economic freedom, you're able to afford these other kind of the social welfare system that they have. So I think it's not that this large state welfare system allowed for them to become rich. I think they became rich and then started being able to provide a lot more benefits.
Yes, we know this because of Johan Norberg and Nima. I can't remember Nima's last name, but he has written several books, some of them published by the Institute of Economic Affairs. So Nima is a Swedish academic from the Middle East, but I think that he lives in Sweden today.
Mhm.
Scandinavian unexceptionalism, an easy to read book. You can access it online.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely have to check that out. I'm not familiar, but it does sound like an
Yeah,
interesting.
Nima. But how could we forget this fascinating point on page 4? The power of the governorship is closely related to the historical influence and cultural attitudes unique to Louisiana. One clear example comes from a veto override veto that effectively gives the governor a second chance to veto a bill. This second veto comes into play due to the governor's relationship with the state's litigation tactics through the attorney general. If a bill passed by the legislature was vetoed by the governor, he or she would still have an option to decline an appeal on, of an unsuccessful defense. Interesting point.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is one of the ways, and it kind of gets to something I was mentioning a little bit earlier in terms of how Louisiana's governor has typically more power than most other governors in the U.S. Right. So because typically how this would work is you have a bill passed. If the governor if the governor doesn't approve of the bill, right, he or she will try to persuade Congress or the legislative branch to not pass it. Well, let's say it passes. Okay, well then governor can veto it, right? And then but then the legislator can again override the veto. Well, if you could veto the override, then you have to start this process over, right? You have to go through the process again. So this gives the governor, if it's a bill that truly legislator has a strong hold on wanting to pass, they could still get it through, right, and force the governor to sign it, basically. But it at least gives the governor more time to do the political process of convincing people within their party or the other party to change their mind, right? So like it gives more time for the governor the opportunity to work the political process to his or her favor. And this is again just one of those situations where, or another example of where you get these better, or you get Louisiana having much stronger power given to the authority executive branch
Yeah.
than others.
So we're wrapping up. This is the last question. Is the resource curse mitigated by economic freedom? And in your article, you were discussing the EFNA index.
Mm-hmm. I would say yes. My argument that I make in the paper, and that I just believe in general to be, is that yes, I think that the resource curse is mitigated if you have institutions in place that allow for other industries to flourish, right? If you're Texas, right, very reliant on oil because they have a large part of the state is on the coast, on the Gulf Coast, where you can extract oil pretty easily. However, they also have very low business taxes. They have low business regulations. They allow other businesses to come in and conduct business in the area. These businesses come in and they are able to basically, I guess the hedge against the, I guess the best way to put it would be the hedge against the volatility of something like oil.
Yes.
So if the whole state economy is just based solely on oil, well, like Louisiana, for example, as a proportion of GDP, Louisiana is one of the highest oil reliant states. So whenever oil isn't doing so well, Louisiana struggles, and they don't have the institutions in place to allow for many other businesses to come in. Anecdotally, you could think about the largest, I believe the only Fortune 500 company that exists in Louisiana is Entergy, which provides electricity and basic utilities to throughout the Gulf South region, but it's also monopoly, right? So their other big industry other than oil is this monopolistic enterprise. So it's not exactly like there's not really a lot of large businesses that are coming in to freely compete and allow for to kind of hedge against the volatility that happens with places that are heavily reliant on resources.
I think that this is a brilliant point. Economic freedom can harness opportunities for economic diversity. So if the economy is diverse, people will transfer their skills to other sectors other than oil or the dominant resource. So this is one reason why growth would be more evident in a country allowing economic freedom. People don't need to depend on oil. And this also suppresses rent seeking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one other industry you could probably think of in this case of COVID would be tourist industry, right? So Louisiana kind of got double hit because New Orleans is a heavy tourist destination in the country. So the biggest, the big industries are oil, a monopoly in terms of electricity, and then tourism in New Orleans. Well, COVID kind of impacted, at least, for sure, tourism as well as oil as well. So they kind of got double hit. And you can also think of like other, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of other like countries that are heavily reliant on tourism, right? So if you're overly reliant on one specific industry, a shock, whether that comes to oil or through travel in terms of COVID and travel restrictions, that doesn't allow for, that you are performing even worse because of those, because you're over reliant on one specific industry. So I think economic freedom allows for economic diversity and diversity of different industries that allow you to hedge against Shocked.
Insecurities and risk, exactly. So Justin, the interview with Vincent was like over 1 hour and 40 minutes. Vincent got lucky. These days I am doing shorter interviews, so don't be jealous of Vincent. I just
Oh
want
no.
to become more succinct. So
Oh yeah,
unfortunately I
I
have
think
to
that makes
wrap
sense.
up,
Yeah.
but it has been a pleasure, and share it online.
Oh, absolutely. I for sure will. Thank you so much,
All
Lipton,
right,
for having me
bye.
on, and I look forward to seeing it. Bye.
Yes, bye, Justin.